Here we are, at the final world. I don't like to discuss this part, and it still bothers me very much, but it's something I have to do, so that I can put this all behind me. People deserve to know. At this point, I was very aware of the game's unnatural nature, but Zenith was different than the other worlds. While the others might have been strange, sometimes frightening, the world of Zenith was a nightmare. I didn't have to go any further than the board screen for an indication that something was wrong with Zenith. The first thing I noticed was the blood-red texture of the board, and the music, which was an eerie whistling tune. I noticed that I had Solomon and Anguirus back, and I felt better for a second. But then I scrolled to the right and saw who my enemies were this time. It was Setsuroya and Ghidorah, but judging from the icon, it was a different Ghidorah than the original, standing on the ground instead of flying. The grotesquely detailed pinkish-red icon also caught my eye. I couldn't tell what it was supposed to be, and I was afraid to find out. Going back to my side of the board, I decided there wasn't much of a choice but to do my usual routine. I was not ready for what happened. I almost jumped out of my chair when this happened, accompanied by a terribly distorted version of the password theme. It looked like Face had fallen victim to a terrible glitch. Is this what he meant by, "Will you miss me"? Did he know this would happen? My thoughts were stopped short as soon as the screen started glitching and seemingly falling apart, so I ran it out quickly. When I got back to the board, I had somehow gained a new monster. I hadn't even been asked if I wanted one. I tried to select it, and this happened. What the hell is going on? The game's behavior was scaring me, and I hadn't even started the levels yet. I couldn't understand why the game would randomly give me a character, and then deny me use of it. For the time being, there was little that could be done, and I viewed the last TV screen. No animation. No music. Every instinct I had was telling me to stop playing, to just turn the game off, and something in the game itself might have been trying to tell me, or warn me just how horrible the last world was. Every stretch of the way I was compelled to give up, but I couldn't now, on the last world. Besides, after taunting me with the memories of Melissa, I felt the game owed me some answers. I noticed that the first level was a red temple, so I thought it would be familiar with the level graphics, if nothing else. I went in with Godzilla. Godzilla had been shrunk, the level and score meters had vanished, and the blue temple statue faces were back. The music was similar to the blue temple also. Strange, haunting vocalizations. I tried to get my spirits up by thinking, well, if this is anything like the blue level, then that might mean there's no enemies to deal with. How wrong I was. After a short walk, all the statue's eyes started glowing, and a pack of the beasts from the Shadow Labyrinth came running towards me. Since they were coming from the right side of the screen, I had to fight my way through them. This battle greatly tested my reflexes, but thanks to my speed, I plowed through the beasts. They gave off health power-ups after dying, which helped with recovering the damage that they did me. However, as I continued through the hallway, the statue's eyes glowed again, summoning another wave. It seemed to be the same number of them, but I was less prepared this time, and took more damage. I had gone through 4 waves until I reached the end of the hall, where I heat-beamed the last of the monsters over the edge into the abyss. At first it seemed I had reached a dead end, but after the statue's eyes stopped glowing, a brick path appeared before me. I followed the path, which kept me moving to the right until it stopped at a wall, where I was to go vertically by jumping up to the ledges. Along the way I encountered new creatures and some sort of strange shrine, which had a statue of the Hell Beast and some other creature I didn't recognize. As I went through, the path took a downward direction. I had to carefully aim my jumps and avoid the enemies, which were plentiful in this part of the stage. They didn't have many attacks, but they could easily shove you off the ledge of the platform. At the end of the tunnel, there was a few smaller platforms floating above nothingness. I landed on one towards the left of the screen, and then something came down from above. It looked like the blue angel from the graveyard, except now it was red and had a skull face. And the pleasant feelings I had for the blue angel were not present with this red one. And as it hovered around, the eye sockets started glowing like the statues, summoning monsters to attack me. Surely this was not the same malevolent creature I encountered before. This must have been some kind of imposter. The battle was nerve-wracking, as I started with nearly half of my health and I had to deal with multiple opponents, as well as the threat of gravity, to make things even worse. As the red angel took damage, some of the panels fell off, until only 3 remained. But my luck had not run out yet. Just as I thought it was over, I struck the red angel one more time and turned out to be the last hit that I needed to take. Just as the red angel completely disintegrated, the game instantly went back to Zenith. I moved Mothra over to the nearest stage of the Red Temple, which seemed like a garbled mess of letters spelling kill, and began playing. As I suspected, all the level graphics were made out of jumbled letters, and Mothra, just like Godzilla, had been shrunk half size. I began to suspect that all Zenith's levels would be like this. The background music was terrible, like if someone put all the sounds that NES was capable of making into a blender and started piecing them back together into a song. I had to turn the volume down because of it. Playing as Mothra helped me avoid enemies a lot easier, but they were nonetheless determined to get me. The first minutes I saw were headless Gigans, and later on hybrid monsters pieced together from the previous bosses, like the Biolante-headed things seen above. 5 minutes had gone by as I had seen nothing new. Then the level shifted into another segment. The music changed from a loud annoying beeps to something far more ambient and menacing. The level graphics had also changed, now looking like a blood-drenched junkyard. The way everything in this level was sickening to look at. The enemies multiplied in number, never ceasing to follow after me, and became harder and harder to avoid. At the end of the level, the situation had reached its climax, as a swarm of monsters fused together into one enormous, terrifying hybrid. Once I had gotten through the initial shock, I discovered that there was a way to destroy it, constantly shooting eye beams into the Hedorah cluster that formed its heads. If you attacked anywhere else, it would regenerate the damage. Even with that knowledge, it was an extremely difficult fight. I'd say it was as hard as fighting the Moon Beast, if not harder. The most common attack was lunging forward at its arms, covered in Gigan saws and blades. If they touched you, it would instantly drain your health. When it was over, the remaining monsters collapsed into a heap. Then they, after the ground below, started to disintegrate and sink towards the bottom of the cave. When I first came back to the board, I thought to myself, so far the game has put the easiest levels first. If that's the case, how bad was the rest of Zenith? With 2 levels down and 3 to go, my monsters had all taken a foothold in the world of the nightmare of Zenith. Deciding what action to take next was the most tense and difficult thing in my life. But ultimately, I had no way of knowing what the next level would be, or how well my monsters were prepared for them. So my option was to guess. I tried to interpret what the icons of the levels ahead of me were. The last level before the boss monsters seemed to be some kind of volcanic area with lava and open flames. The middle icon I still didn't get, except that it looked fleshy and vaguely like an organ. The one nearest to me and the one I was about to enter looked like thorny veins covered in a puddle of blood. I guess this would be the level with blood rivers, like the chase levels in Dementia. As such, I went with Anguirus, due to his rolling ability. The level, which I called Blood Lake, looked like I expected. Rivers of blood accompanied by thorny-covered vines, which were then scattered along the sides of the ground. The music was rather faint, but I could hear a distant drum beat and a few other instruments. A lot of echoes, and something sounding like they were hitting a drum underwater. As I expected, Anguirus shrunk just as Godzilla and Mothra did. I felt less secure with my giant monsters no longer being so giant. I walked along without interruption for a minute until my path had reached a dead end. There was a massive gap between the ground I was walking on and the ground to the right of the screen. I would have swam across it, continuing on to the right, but due to the huge mass of branches in the way, there was nowhere to go. 2 creatures with gliding membranes in their arms, and lamprey-like mouths, were perched on the outstretched vines and screeching at me, much like a crow does when an invader gets in its territory. Another unnerving display of possible sentience by the creatures of this game, if it's even accurate to refer this as a game anymore. I descended into the blood, sinking slowly to the floor. Aquatic enemies were everywhere, and they were very hard to avoid. The black shark in particular was very aggressive and hard to deal with, but thankfully I only encountered one. As the scene becomes more and more crowded, I swam up to the surface to find that it would be littered with floating corpses. Creepy set piece, but no threat, I thought. They were trying to pull me under, and they were draining my health as they did. They attacked as a group, and when I got one off me, another would jump on behind it. I had to curl up in a ball and roll until to loosen their grip, and then when I did, I quickly retreated. It wasn't long before I reached another land path. I was interrupted by this screen. The screen was only up for about 30 seconds, then it went back to the level. I was facing another dead end, and a pregnant humanoid creature was hanging from the top right of the screen by a spine or umbilical cord. Instantly, the creature's belly was split open from the inside, and the lower part of the body was ripped apart and fell into the river below. The Blood Lake's boss has been revealed. It came flying towards me, making a shrill hacking sound. I was forced to move back. The bat was highly mobile, fast, and very difficult to hit. As I moved back along the ground, the monster opened up its mouth and shot a barrage of needles. I jumped over them and managed to give it a blow on the head, and it started flying out of my reach. As the bat was flying, it shot a stream of fire out of its eye sockets, and started trying to hit me with the flames as I rolled across the ground, draining much of my power. This cycle repeated about 3 times until the monster was defeated. With most of my health drained, I went back to the edge of the level, and the large bramble vine blocking the exit was now gone. Now only 2 more levels to go. Godzilla, Mothra, and Anguirus had all completed 1 level, leaving Solomon, and also the mysterious 5th monster. I tried to get to access it, but with no luck. I chose to use Godzilla again for the next level, and Solomon for the final one. The penultimate level was what I refer to as the organic level, which was the most visually unpleasant out of all of them. Right from the start, I could see that the graphics were freakishly different. The atmosphere was gruesome and foreboding, with the addition of loud, drowning noises. I was dreading what I would see at these levels, and only a few minutes had happened before something appeared. 2 hideous things. It's hard to describe most of the level. Everything was so disturbing and being semi-realistic look to it. Most of the enemies looked halfway between real animals and misshapen lumps of gore and real teeth. It was also worth noting that all of them were considerably larger than Godzilla, and although the majority of them were not very intelligent, each of them took around 30 hits to kill. Due to this, it was a better idea to run away from them than fight, but it was never clear what exactly direction to run in. While most of the levels involved going to the right to the exit, the path of this level was primarily going down, by walking to the edge of the platform and jumping to a lower one. There was no way to make sure that you were going the right way, nor any apparent means of going back up to the higher platforms if necessary. Also, certain enemies acted as if they were aware you had to jump down, and would stand there on the lower edge of the platform, waiting for you. When this happened, I had to walk back until the monster would leave. As I went on, I came across a platform stacked above each other, with little space in between, making it look like a maze. This meant I couldn't jump, and made escape from the enemies difficult. Thankfully, the only enemies I had to fight in these mazes were 4-legged beasts seen at the beginning of the level. Adding to the difficulty were long tapeworm-esque monsters that would rise themselves up between 2 platforms and trap you in. This was costing even more power, and I couldn't afford to do it without the health beam for very long. While trying to avoid the abominations that dwell in this level, I found out that you can stand idle for one place too long. The ground tries to absorb your monster. I think it was about 4 minutes before the end of the level made me physically sick. The tension was getting to me, and having to take in all these disgusting sights made me want to puke. I nearly did pause the game and look for a bag, but I was able to hold it together. Finally, it was time for another boss fight. It was certainly ugly, but not quite as horrific as I feared it would be. But more important than dealing with its appearance was defeating it. And since I had less than half my life bar to start with, there was no room for errors. It was attached from the floor when I first saw it, but after 10 hits it detached from the floor and began floating. It was fast, and unlike the Blood Lake monsters, he wasn't impeded by any sort of gravity. It was able to fly through the ground without any collision effect. It used this to an advantage. It would float beneath the ground and spring up randomly just to bite you. It stopped doing this, however, after a few well-placed kicks to its face. The pink area on its upper jaw was the weak point. Too many hits there would cause it to spasm uncontrollably. The new strategy was to rapidly float up and down while moving back and forth across the stage, trying to consistently keep its jaws aimed towards me. Health was going to be critical at this point, and I spammed the heat beam from which it had no defense. It was the last stretch of the battle, and the monster had lost its mind, rapidly rushing back and forth and gnashing at its jaws. I had to duck under it, then strike it when its back was turned to me. 20 more hits and it was destroyed. One more level to go. I didn't hesitate. I selected Solomon and entered. Perhaps a little too fast. This last level was definitely the peak of the disconnect between what the NES was graphically capable of and what the game could create. The music also caught my attention. It was one of the only songs that appeared more than once. The horrible screeching from when the Hell Beast appeared in the graveyard. As soon as I started, there was an enemy prepared to attack, a centaur wielding a whip, and it wasn't alone. When I started fighting, several more centaurs appeared, coming from both sides of the screen at the same time. It was too much to handle. Solomon's flight saved me from taking too much damage at the start of the level. The centaurs followed after, but seemingly they were unable to jump. After escaping the centaurs, I noticed gaps in the ground. While trying to avoid the jumping sword-mouthed enemies in the middle of the fight, I got close to the surface of lava and a creature emerged trying to grab me. It didn't succeed, but I was startled. Careful maneuvering would be needed to avoid instant death. As new enemies appeared, the level soon became very difficult. A lot of trouble came from the stocky red enemies that stood on top of a tall, narrow mountain and spewed fire. I got by them by waiting till their backs were turned and hit them with a flying kick, which made them fall into the lava. It was around this time that I noticed that I wasn't gaining health from killing enemies. Not all the ground was stable. At one point, the ground was reduced to small chunks and slowly drifted to the right. Some of them would sink into the lava upon landing on them, and there was no way to tell which ones would sink and which ones wouldn't. Being so close to the lava added the threat of the lava creatures, so this was frustrating. I was feeling very hot, which made me concentrate harder. If you ever had a heat rash, it felt similar to that. I would periodically stop for water because of it. I thought this was most certainly due to the game and not my imagination, but I kept pushing that thought out of my head. I didn't want to think about it. At the end of the stage, I encountered a boss rising from the lava. Its arrival noted an ungodly howling roar. When I walked on land, I saw how gigantic it was, several times the size of Solomon. I went to fly up and attack, and it opened its mouth and let out a huge burst of fire. I can fly to dodge the flames and then get close enough to the boss to fire a heat beam to its face, causing it to stumble backwards. If it didn't stumble backwards, it would have kept moving to the left until it forced Solomon into the lava, as there was no more ground within reach. The beast had to wait between uses of its fire breath, and it seemed to cost a great deal of energy. I used this time to attack it, but the fire wasn't the only weapon, and I had to worry about a monster swatting me away with its clawed hands. The battle felt like a tug-of-war between the two monsters over the bridge of land. After about 40 hits, it was defeated, tumbling downwards into the lava where it came from. And then the final stage had been completed. At last, it was down to the two bosses in the final encounter with the Hell Beast. For some reason, I thought Ghidorah would be easier to fight, so I confronted him first. The classic Ghidorah battle music from the original game had started up as I was faced with the new King Ghidorah. King Ghidorah was as powerful and unrelenting as ever. He instantly lashed out with a gravity beam, which were more damaging than Godzilla's heat beam. It had become a struggle of constantly beating up Ghidorah at every opportunity, that way he could keep him from attacking. But Ghidorah soon saw through my tactic and started using physical attacks as well. He would strike with each one of his necks, knocking me backwards and making it impossible to get close enough to punch him. I had an idea, to wait for him to lunge with one of his heads and immediately blast it with a heat beam. It worked, and to my surprise, the heat beam actually obliterated Ghidorah's middle head. It was only a few seconds before I realized what this would lead to, and sure enough, King Ghidorah was using the power of the glitch to transform himself into Mecha-King Ghidorah. What really shocked me though was the sudden change of music. I had heard it before, but it wasn't from the original NES game. It was from the game Super Godzilla during the Mecha-King Ghidorah fight. Mecha-King Ghidorah's first attack was its most deadly, the machine hand. Very similar to Gigan's saw, it would immobilize the monster and rapidly drain down the health bar. Fortunately, before Ghidorah could do a lot of damage, the timer ran out. I would need to defeat Mecha-Godzilla quickly to prevent him from using the machine hand, so I sent Solomon in to fight him. The two monsters were evenly matched in strength, but Solomon was faster, and by slashing and heat beaming without pause, the cyborg monster soon met its end. With Ghidorah defeated, I was returned to the board. I now outnumbered the enemy by 4 monsters to 1, and victory seemed to be soon at hand. The base icon had changed to a blood red color. I could feel hatred emanating from it. I started to fight with Desidoria with Anguirus, and the music was the same as Ghidorah's. When the fight began, Desidoria was in a microscopic form. After one hit, it changed to the Juvenile, which had a few attacks but was easy to deal with. The fight became more serious when Desidoria entered the aggregate form, gaining the use of large arms and micro-oxygen beams. Anguirus' roll attack, which had been very useful up to now, was rendered useless by Desidoria consistently attacking me with his large arms every time I tried to use it. For this part of the fight, I had to rely on my brute strength. Just before the time ran out, Desidoria had changed to his flying form, which Anguirus was ill-suited to fight. Going back in, I fought the flying form with Mothra, which seemed pretty fitting. Mothra was weaker than Anguirus, but was much better equipped to dodge and counter flying Desidoia's attacks, so the fight was in my favor. However, the Mecha-King Ghidorah fight music started playing, and Desidoria changed into his final form soon after, which drastically turned the tables. Mothra's attacks were doing very little to Desidoria, and I had to move furiously to avoid damage while waiting for the timer to run out. Even though it would be near impossible to beat Desidoria with Mothra, I still had 3 other monsters. Final form Desidoria was very resistant to taking damage, and the heavily armored foe would not be defeated without a long fight. In the last part of the fight, it wasn't much strategy, just attack as brutally and as fast as I could. On the last bar of health Desidoria had, he used a counterattack, a beam of energy from his chest. I didn't know how powerful it would be, but just before it could fire, I punched Desidoria in the chest cavity, destroying him, and that was it. The last kaiju boss had been defeated. In the midst of all of the excitement, I had briefly forgotten that there was still one thing I needed to do before the game was over. Seeing the icon again hit me like a ton of bricks. I froze for a few minutes. I had come so far to get to this point, but I was terrified. I really didn't know what to expect in the last encounter. Before I could let myself think about it any longer, I moved Godzilla over to the stage. You're here now. This is the end. Just one thing, and it's all over. And when the screen changed, there was nothing. Just Godzilla and a black screen. When I walked back and forth and fired a heat beam, nothing happened. Till I heard something. The faint sound of a familiar drum beat.